My name is Vicki Lehman, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist at Childcare Answers. So, Childcare Answers is the local childcare resource and referral agency for Hamilton, Hendricks, and Marion counties. We work with families, we work with individuals in the community, other agencies. We work to get childcare providers connected. We work to connect families to childcare and really provide that education and that support. And we have somebody who can work with you one-on-one and offer additional supports and connections to resources. We are a nonprofit. We operate on a contract through the state of Indiana, and everything we do is totally free. And these workshops are part of the work that we do. And we are always so grateful and so thankful to have outside partners such as Megan at Autism Learning Partners, who are willing to present and share their content, knowledge, and their expertise with families and the individuals that we serve in the communities.
Today, I'm going to talk about managing challenging behaviors. Like Vicki said, I'm from Autism Learning Partners. So we work with individuals with autism, and we do provide ABA therapy. Our organization is actually a nationwide organization, so we are located in 17 different states across the U.S., but then specific to here in Indiana, we provide in-home services and clinic services on the north side of Indianapolis. And so we'll just jump right in. I wanted to kind of just talk through challenging behaviors from the get-go, and also make sure that I say, any of the strategies that we are talking about all apply to just behavior in general. So not specific to individuals with autism or special needs. This is just general behavior. So a lot of those common challenging behaviors that we see as parents, involve things like refusing to follow instructions, screaming, throwing things, arguing, even pouting and crying, your tantrum behaviors, those typical tantrum behaviors that you may see. But those are kind of like the most common challenging behaviors that we see across kids, across all ages as well. And a lot of times how we often handle those as parents is doing a number of these things. So some questioning, like, why are you doing that? Why would you have done that? Arguing back, even, especially when we're talking about maybe some older children, sarcasm and teasing, which, a lot of times it depends on how the relationship is with the child. If they're able to reciprocate that and understand that and take that lightly, instead of taking it personally, especially in like a heated moment. Criticism, potentially threats, and not, we're not talking like, direct, really aggressive threats, but even things like, if you don't stop doing that, you get no more iPad time tonight, something like that. Force is another way, obviously, using despair in some way, trying to reason or use logic, or like I said, with the threats, taking things away. So, kind of the typical ways in which we respond to challenging behaviors, these are what we typically see across the board. The thing that is important to keep in mind is that there are effects to that. And so some of those can deal with a child wanting to, avoid either that type of a situation, or, the parent or guardian or adult who's responding to those challenging behaviors that way. Escape in general, getting even, learning those responses, potentially being coercive responses. And then also a lot of times responding in those ways, the child is receiving attention for inappropriate behavior. So it may seem like that is, maybe not necessarily a bad thing because we're attending to it, but we'll be getting into why that could actually be problematic. Potentially developing just a weaker relationship with the child by responding in those ways that we talked about. And I am so sorry, I have an 8-month-old, so I'm sure you can hear that. So the first tool that I like to talk about for strengthening and building skills is reinforcement. And the thing with reinforcement, but when we're talking about behavior is just largely a product of the immediate environment and experiences. So when I say behavior, we really do mean anything that a child is doing. So your job or our job as parents is to help make our children want to do something desirable by creating improvements with the way we interact with our children, and then also the consequences that we provide when those desirable behaviors aren't happening. So where we can start to make improvements is by modeling it ourselves. So a lot of times, we as parents, we know that, what we do, our kids are watching, or what teachers do, our kids are watching, what, their celebrity or whoever their fan favorite person is doing, the kids are watching. And so appropriate behavior is obviously modeled. Behavior in general is modeled for a child. To make improvements, we obviously want to make sure that is at most appropriate most often. We also want to make sure the expectations that we have for our children are clear and reasonable. We want to make sure that we're monitoring their behavior. So if we've set expectations, then we're also following through with that. So we're monitoring them. We're trying to make sure we're seeing improvements on their end based on those expectations that we've set. And then also that whatever the discipline or behavior management system is that we have in place is also consistent. That's the biggest piece. So to kind of help get us to a point where we're able to do all of those things, it's kind of like, okay, so where do we start and what else can we do in order to get here easily? So I like to talk about the ABC of behavior, and you may have already heard of this, or you might be an expert at this already. But when we're talking about the ABC of behavior, we're really talking about the antecedent, then the behavior is the B, and then the consequence is the C. So the antecedent, something that comes before, it's, the trigger. The behavior is anything that person or the child does. And then the consequence is what happens right after that behavior. So, the payoff for whatever that behavior was. So the example here is, very simple. The phone rings, you answer the phone, whoever it is says hello. So the biggest thing with the antecedent is that it's when we're talking about that and we're saying, so what happened right before? A lot of times it's easy to go into like earlier that day. And sometimes that's applicable, but a lot of times it's easier if we're really looking at what happened immediately before whatever that behavior was. So if we're trying to identify, why did a child throw that toy and, they seem upset or they're starting to engage in tantrum behaviors, it could have something to do with whatever happened earlier in the day, or there could have been something a little bit more immediate to that situation that we really want to pay attention to. So when I'm thinking of an antecedent within this ABC model, we're really looking at what happened immediately before versus earlier in the day. Behavior includes everything. So we're looking at not just the desirable or healthy behaviors, we're looking at just your common everyday behaviors, and then also any of those undesirable behaviors or, the challenging behaviors that we talked about earlier. The consequence is something salient that happens immediately after. So all of this was laid out in that chart, but this is another one where it's really important that we're focused on what happened right after versus much later. So a lot of times, if I'm thinking of a very basic situation and we're talking about that child who threw a toy, it could be that after they threw the toy, they had to pick it up and put it away. And then they, were able to, they got a snack or something like that. And when you're looking at the consequence, it might be easy to say, well, they were probably hungry because they ended up receiving a snack. But it's a little bit easier to look at more immediately after. So after they threw the toy, if it was like, okay, they had to pick that toy up, I made sure that they did, they had a task that was presented to them, or even more basic than that, they were provided attention. So they threw something and we responded to them. They were provided attention. They were also, yes, told to pick up the toy and then given a snack, but we're really looking at that right after. With consequences, so like I was talking about, there are really the two main types. So we have immediate consequences, and then we also have delayed consequences. So immediate, like I was saying, is, you know, the most effective use of a consequence for our children, and it is something that we see as it can affect behavior the most as well, versus a delayed consequence. So you push a doorbell, you hear the sound, that's very immediate. A delayed consequence would be you're saving money to buy a new car, or, you know, you're saving money for this vacation. It's delayed. Sometimes that's pretty difficult. So if you're thinking about it in that way, a lot of times for kids, you know, saying if you have a great week, then on Saturday we can, you know, go here, or get whatever toy or get whatever, you know, treat it is. So depending on the child, that delayed consequence can be like just a little too long for it to be successful. And it may need to be more immediate, or at least a little bit more immediate than, you know, a week's worth, or however long that delay is. The effects that our consequences have is that they obviously do one or two things. They can increase the future behavior and make it happen more often if it was a good consequence, or they can decrease or weaken the future behavior so that it doesn't happen as often in the future. If you've heard this language or talked about as like positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. So we're looking at with positive reinforcement, if we provide something contingent or based on a certain behavior happening, and that behavior happens again in the future, then we're like, okay, great, that was positive reinforcement. That was exactly what we wanted to do, hopefully. When we're looking at negative reinforcement, we're talking about whether we saw some sort of behavior that happened and we took something away. So we talked about those coercives, like we removed a toy or we removed the iPad or something like that, but we're still seeing that behavior happen again. Those are the two branches off of that top bullet point of increasing future behavior. So we can either do that through reinforcement, whether it's positive or negative. For decreasing or weakening future behavior, that actually is more about punishment technically. So either providing something contingent on a behavior and it still weakens or decreases the likelihood that that behavior happens again. That would be an example of positive punishment. Or negative punishment would be if the child throws the toy and it's taken away and they don't throw it again in the future. Then that is an example of negative, where the toy was removed, contingent on whatever behavior happened. And then the child learned in that moment, okay, I'm not going to throw the toy because it gets taken away. Otherwise, consequences aside from that can also have just no effect on the behavior that it follows. So there's kind of those caveats to the effects of consequences, which a lot of times, if you're not really thinking of that, it's easy to lose track of, you know, like, oh, it's a consequence. I think as parents, you know, we throw that term around a little loosely, like if you do that, there will be consequences. But this hopefully helps frame exactly what we are hoping we're doing with those consequences. Whatever we're presenting, hopefully we know in which way we're hoping to either increase or decrease the behaviors we're looking at. So the hint here then, consequences obviously either strengthen or weaken behavior like we talked about. And the only way to really know that is to look to the future. So the next time, did that behavior happen again in that same situation, or right immediately in that moment? So, you know, as a child, I know there were times that, you know, if I threw something and my mom said no, and for whatever reason I thought that was funny, if I threw it again, then now at this point in my life, I realize, okay, that was not work. Her no was definitely not a consequence that decreased the likelihood of me doing that again, even right in the moment. So that's a good way to identify for yourself whether or not whatever your consequence is beneficial and working the way you want it to. So then your job, or our job as parents, is to identify the behavior we want to see more, and then deliver consequences that motivate our children to do that behavior again. So one of the biggest and most useful consequences is attention. This is huge, and in the work that I do, working with families, and families with children with disabilities and without, attention is the biggest piece. So Dr. Glenn Latham, this is kind of a lot of this is based off of a book that he has out, and it's called The Power of Positive Parenting. Attention is the biggest thing, and I see that across the board, and it doesn't always have to be attention the way that we're thinking of it. So it may not necessarily be like high praise, or like, oh, you're doing such a good job, or how was your day, but any sort of attention, eye contact, or we talk about attention of like a physical touch, so a pat on the back, or if you just are lightly touching their head, something like that, holding their hand, that sort of attention is so useful and so valuable to most kids, that it's free and we have it with us at all times. And a lot of times I see challenging behaviors arise when attention is not available, or the child feels like it's being deprived of attention in some way. So attention, just keep that in mind as being really one of the most useful tools that you have and you have available at all times. So I talked about the first tool being reinforcement, and I feel like this is a pretty common term that's used nowadays. A lot of times it's used interchangeably with reward, but it's a little bit different. So reinforcement is a type of consequence that, when we're talking about it in terms of wanting to manage challenging behaviors, hopefully it increases the desirable behavior that it follows, and increases then the chances that that happens again in the future. We talked about the different types of reinforcement. So there are 6 major kinds or forms of reinforcement that are key to think of when you're dealing with managing challenging behavior. Those include social interaction, praise, appropriate touch, things or access to something, appropriate privileges, and breaks from different tasks or work. And these are really important. And if you're, paying attention, they're really all stemming around attention. So the social interaction, the praise, the touch, access to something, which requires an interaction with someone, privileges, these are big things to kids, and we all use them, but it's kind of figuring out a way to use it in the most efficient way for you and the most effective way for you, especially when looking at challenging behaviors. So when should you use reinforcement? All the time. And so I think that we think we're using it a lot more than we do. It's interesting. I remember seeing this in the curriculum of kids need reinforcement, 20 times an hour. And I remember thinking, that's easy. Like, they absolutely have access to that 20 times an hour, I bet. But they really don't. And if you were to kind of sit back and maybe take some of your own data at home, or just kind of assess, when you can people watch, how much attention is a child really getting per hour, and when are they receiving that? Is it after something, positive or not? I think that is, one of the biggest things to look at. So 20 times an hour. So why use reinforcement? We've started talking about it, but it's really helpful for teaching new behaviors. So like we said, if we're using reinforcement well, we're providing it contingent upon a certain behavior happening immediately after that behavior, and we're hoping we see that behavior again in the future. So teaching new behaviors, it's perfect for maintaining desirable behaviors. So when you see something awesome, using reinforcement in some way. And I think the difference that I was talking about in terms of reinforcement versus a reward really lends to that point, where we talked about the 6 types. A lot of those, like some of it said things are appropriate privileges, but we're not talking about, rewarding with candy or a toy or something, every time we see something awesome. Like we really need to utilize that attention piece. We have the ability to provide good quality, meaningful attention to our children based on appropriate or desirable behaviors. And that is reinforcement. And then also using it to replace undesirable behaviors with desirable behaviors. So we'll go through now some steps to using reinforcement, just kind of breaking it down a little bit based on these reasons why I suggest using it. So I'll just leave this up here as I talk through it, but steps to use reinforcement. So first, telling the child what behavior you liked, if that's appropriate. So within reason, if we're talking about older kids, that the way we deliver that may be different versus a younger child. But if you think of in the very, basic sense of, I like the way you raised your hand, it may sound patronizing to an older child. Right. So we'd want to be careful with that. But for younger children, it's helpful to name what it is that they're doing well for them. So telling them what behavior you liked, and then providing a consequence that matches the value of that. So again, this really speaks to that piece of reinforcement versus reward. We're not suggesting, delivering a piece of candy or an edible item of some sort or a toy or something outrageous just because your child did one little thing that you've been wanting them to work on. We want that value to match. It should match because we want it to be as natural as possible. So working on that consequence so that you aren't in a spot where you feel like, okay, if I have to really like amp it up, I have to deliver something amazing in order for this to work. That's hopefully not where we're at. Step 3, providing that consequence within 3 seconds of recognizing the behavior if possible. So that sounds really quick, I'm sure. But we talked about the immediacy and the importance of that earlier. So that's really the key here. We want to make sure whatever consequence we're providing, we're doing it as quickly as possible so that our child understands this is the behavior that they're trying to reinforce and they're trying to teach me as a good behavior. Using sincere and appropriate facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. So that's really important as well. I think taking that moment and being able to very genuinely express happiness and being proud and grateful for the positive and good behavior that your child demonstrated, instead of being rushed or just trying to very quickly like great job. We want to make sure it's genuine and that our child understands that. Avoid reacting to junk behavior, and I'll say that in quotes, and we'll get to that. But it's kind of an easy way to talk and think about some behaviors that sometimes are difficult to ignore or difficult to not react to, but are really helpful to not react to if you can. So that's coming up as well. Avoid using coercion. So like, we talked about, those were the first few slides. Those coercive behaviors are the typical ways in which we respond with, questioning. So if you see something great, oh, I love the way you did that. But if you could not do, or I didn't like how you did this, we would want to avoid doing that and just focus on what that appropriate thing was, get through these, steps or this sequence in which we're providing the reinforcement. And then we're going to address whatever it was that we didn't want to see in a different way. And then again, lastly, making sure that that consequence is actually reinforcing. So that's going to be huge as well. Make sure that we talked about, as you're providing consequences, you're seeing that it's working. You're seeing that whatever you're providing reinforcement for, those behaviors are happening again, or the child's responding in a way that indicates that they're happy and they're receiving that message from you. That's super important. So behavior specific praise, like we talked about, really naming that behavior that we're happy to see. We just kind of lay out a variety of different ways that you can kind of change it up so you're not always saying great job or something that's blanketed and very similar. You can say praise and great job in a variety of ways. So you're doing a nice job. Thank you for, I'm proud of you. It's nice that you're doing this. You should be proud of yourself. For little kids, like good boy, like good job doing this, or how sweet of you to do X, Y, or Z. And then I think too, there's examples here of what, I would say are very praisable behaviors and things that sometimes do get overlooked. So not just playing nicely with others, but playing nicely in general. So if your child's sitting and entertaining themselves and playing really well, providing some praise for that. If they're using their inside voice, providing praise for that, sharing, sitting still, saying thank you, sitting at the table, just doing things, everyday things, making sure that we are drawing attention to that. We're providing that free thing that we have to provide to our children, that is often very valuable to them. So making sure we're paying attention to that. So hints here on matching that value of the behavior with the consequence that we talked about. So desirable behaviors that are important and difficult should always get a bigger reward. And then the smaller behaviors should get a smaller reward. So if you're working on something that's really difficult for your child, then make sure you're amping that reinforcement up when they do it. If you know it's difficult, have that be the big reward, save it for that. And those smaller behaviors are the things that it's like, you should just do that. And we're really hoping to get you to the point where you are, but I'm going to use a little bit of reinforcement while we're working towards it. They get the smaller rewards or the smaller reinforcers. And then remember that behaviors that seem easy to you may be very difficult for a child. So the consequence needs to be matched with the value for the child and not with what your perceived value is of that behavior. So certain things are going to be tougher for a child in general, but also every child's different. So certain things just may be a little bit more difficult for one child versus the other. And so making sure that we're being mindful of that and really being able to provide a consequence that is valuable to the child is important. So some hints on timing. When possible, deliver that reward, like we said, within 3 seconds of recognizing the appropriate behavior. So as soon as possible. And when this isn't possible, at least make sure you're using that behavior specific praise. So, I really again, I love how you raised your hand, or thank you for using your inside voice. Thank you for walking, those sorts of things. Try to limit yourself to about 8 to 9 words. So that's another thing too. And it's kind of, if you think back again to those coercives or the typical ways, the logic reasoning, a lot of times, after a while, the joke is that it's very, Charlie Brown voice-ish, right? So after so many words, you're just lost and the child may not be listening and it's losing its value. So, keep it short and sweet when you're using that behavior specific praise, but make sure that they are being acknowledged for what they're doing that is positive and something that's desirable. And then also that longer delays often lead to weaker consequences. So it does kind of depend, and this would be dependent upon your child specifically. But depending on the value of that consequence, a long delay may devalue it. And it just would, depend on what that is. But as immediate as possible, or the shortest delay between the behavior and the consequence, is always our best recommendation. So how do you know if a consequence was reinforcing? We talked about this. You compare it off how often that behavior occurred before you gave that reward or reinforcer to how often it occurs after you gave it. So if you notice that you say like, wow, thank you so much for walking, or thank you so much for putting your shoes away. And your child, starts beaming and they're so happy and they do it again. Then that's a good indicator that that was reinforcing for them, that they loved that consequence. So you need to be paying attention to, the future and if it happens again. If you observe the child is doing the behavior more independently or even with less assistance, that's also a good indicator that the consequence is reinforcing in some way. So if it is, like, great job, using your fork, or great job using your napkin, and then you have, that child that's like, I want to do it myself, that's actually good. And they may be messy with it, and it may not be, they may not be as efficient as you are with some of those things, but seeing that independence, if they are responding to, praise from you, or attention in some way, that's a very good indicator that that consequence is reinforcing for them, and that's a positive thing. Also remember, sometimes as parents, we just can't control all the consequences a child receives. So that's, just very, very accurate, especially nowadays with access to, technology and just the different things that kids are able to access now. But what we can do is we can really, beef up or really focus on the consequences that we're providing for the appropriate behaviors when they're at least with us. So can't control everything, but we can control what we're doing. And this also then encourages the child to engage in those same behaviors when they're in other environments as well. So reinforcement is a very, simple tool. I know it's maybe seemed like there, isn't really a need for the 7 steps, but it's kind of helpful to break it down and really think of it in terms of, it's not just, antecedent behavior consequence and hoping that consequence is a reinforcer of in some way, but it's really using it to our advantage, understanding how it functions and how we can use that in a way to see desirable behaviors continue, and also, building up that relationship with our children as well, identifying that praise is a pretty powerful tool, and that piece of attention usually works really, really well for kids. And so, again, something very easily accessible for all of us to use. So that is reinforcement. So now we'll go into, what about the negative behaviors? Because everything isn't always, catching kids doing the best things always and not having to handle any of the negative behaviors or the challenging behaviors. And I talked about as well avoiding that junk behavior. So we will get into that. So as a parent, your job or our job is, like we said, notice the desirable behaviors, know what rewards or reinforcers work for your child, provide those for the child based on desirable behaviors, so that that payoff is bigger than when they're engaging in these less desirable or these challenging behaviors. You're really trying to kind of tilt the scale on that. So the tool that we talk about for responding to negative behaviors is called pivot. So I guess maybe thinking of the basketball move, pivot, or I'm not very sporty or athletic, so I think of the show Friends and that hilarious episode, if you know that. But pivot, that's your tool for responding to negative behaviors. So I had talked about junk behavior, and that's behavior that I'm talking about that it doesn't necessarily cause any physical harm or damage. So we're not talking about aggression or anything like that, breaking things. We're just talking about the behaviors that are like junky. So they happen a lot. They're annoying. They're often specific to an age, right? So sticking your tongue out as a kid, stuff like that. That's not going to hurt anyone. It's not going to do any damage to anyone else, to the child, to property, but not things that we love or we want to see often. So more examples: mumbling, rolling eyes, stomping feet, whining, saying mean things to others. So I guess in a sense, yes, hurtful to other people, but not physically hurtful. cursing, which also the caveat there is, obviously we don't want any of our children cursing, but especially in certain environments, that's completely unacceptable. And then complaining. So these are all things that I would think of when I'm thinking of junk behavior and when we're talking about, at home or when they're engaging in these things with us as parents. So why this happens? There's attention again. So a lot of times we see this as a way to get attention that they need. So if you even think about a lot of times, when you first meet little kids and they're still in that somewhat shy stage, when we see shyness, a lot of times we see, that like bashfulness, or they do silly things, like they do stick out their tongue, or they kind of run away and hide. But they're looking back and they still do somewhat want that interaction. So that, doing those things to get attention, doing things like that to get comfort, doing things like that to see you react. So especially as we talk about our kids who get older, a lot of times that power struggle, the reaction from mom or dad or sibling when, they do X, Y, or Z is just so amazing for some kids. And we need to flip the script on that to make you angry. So like we talked about, to get some of that negative attention from you, or it could be motivated from coercion because they're, most familiar with that, to get you to give in to them. So a lot of times, those like stomping feet, screaming, those things, they just are hoping you're going to break and give in to make you go away. Very similar to giving in, or to get you to do something for them. So a lot of times, these are the reasons why we see some of those junk behaviors happen. So the pivot tool, this is a better way, or my suggestion for a way to get rid of those junk behaviors, or at least manage those while you're still being able to build and strengthen desirable behaviors and maintain a really positive relationship. So the steps to pivot, trying your very best not to say anything about the junk behavior. And that is so difficult. And like I said, depending on some of those, you may need to say something, or the environment that you're in. But in the most basic sense, if you can, not say anything about the junk behavior and not react, that would be best. Because if you think back to the slide before this, why are they doing it? To get your attention, to get you to react, to get you to be upset, to engage in that power struggle. So if you cannot give that to them, that's going to be the key. So the pivot piece here would be, not reacting or saying anything, and actively attending to someone else who's doing something that's desirable. So in the most basic sense, if your, child is whining and complaining about homework and the sibling is doing their homework, like not responding to the whining and the complaining and pivoting to the other sibling who's doing a great job, and just kind of providing reinforcement for that to the other child, giving them that attention. And what you could see is the other child, okay, now I see how I can gain access to that. And then you provide reinforcement for that stop in the junk behavior. So pivoting back to them. And I think, here, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking like, well, my kid wouldn't see that and just go right into doing something positive. They're going to amp it up, or they're going to keep going, or they're going to look at it as a way to get out of whatever they were doing anyways, because now I'm not responding to them. And that's definitely reasonable to say and reasonable to discuss. And I think that is talking about, really then focusing in outside of those more heated situations like that, where you are trying to use reinforcement a lot more. So like we talked about on the first slide of pivot, where it really is trying to tip the scale. So making sure that your child has enough examples and understanding of how to gain access to that positive attention from you, or whatever it is that they're trying to gain from you, in the best way that they can. So that something like pivot would work well. So not reacting to the behavior. So not saying stop that or don't do that. Not rolling your eyes, kind of stomping out of the room or staring at the child, because a lot of times this is the attention they want. So even eye contact is huge. I see that a lot where a child throws something and looks to see what mom or dad thinks, or they scream and they look to see what mom and dad thinks about that. Or if I'm sure any situation you have where their siblings are fighting, and as soon as they hear someone coming, they both look. So they're looking for that attention from the parent or the guardian. So really trying hard not to react to that. And then helpful hints for, when you do that pivot move and you're not attending to the child engaging in junk behavior. So the other person, you're pivoting to another child or another person who's engaging in desirable behavior. If you don't have another person to pivot to, just do something else. So pivot away from that junk behavior. Do what your normal routine is, start cooking dinner, start watching TV, pick up a book, whatever it is, scroll or something on your phone, but pivot yourself away from the junk behavior and engage in another activity without responding to that. And then the desirable behavior. So it's hard, but you can pivot to other good behavior the child is doing as well. So if you do have a child that you're like, hey, I really can't walk away, or it won't work if I, say good things to their sibling, then what you can do is try to provide some reinforcement for the positive things. So if they're doing their homework, this example, so they're doing their homework, but they're just complaining the whole time, at least they're doing it. So, not really acknowledging that complaining, because that probably is for attention if they're actually doing the task, and just complimenting them on finishing their homework. If, they're just laying there like, I really don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Finding something else that you can provide some praise for, whether it is just trying part of it, whatever the task is, doing part of it, doing half of it, but trying to find a way to not have to acknowledge that junk behavior, but pivot to something that is a little bit more desirable so that you can engage with reinforcement. Some more important points about rewarding those good behaviors. So trying to provide that reinforcement after a little break in the junk behavior. So about 10 seconds, but you want to make sure you're not pivoting back too fast, if that makes sense, to where it's pretty salient that you are now providing praise and reinforcement for something other than that junk behavior. Remember that verbal praise should be short and sweet, we talked about. So not too much. You're definitely not going to want to use that logic and reasoning of, oh, thank you for not whining, or I love when you're not whining, and now that you're sitting calmly. We're going to want to avoid that, because that would also be providing that junk behavior with some sort of attention. And then, sometimes just stopping the junk behavior is the reward. So stomping feet versus standing quietly, tugging at your sleeve versus hands down, and waiting. It's just those little things, those little improvements that are going to be huge. So the child may still be upset, but they're no longer crying. That's something that you can definitely provide reinforcement for. Remembering your 6 kinds of reinforcement when you pivot back, and making it as realistic and, like I said, genuine as possible. So it doesn't have to be a statement even. You can just go and offer a quick hug, a pat on the back when they, have calmed down and now they're doing whatever they were supposed to be doing, or they're at least not engaging in a bunch of the junk. And then really remembering also to avoid making that comparison of the good child to the bad child, which, is why you just want to be as genuine as possible to your child when you're using this tool. So not thinking of it as really having to pinpoint, something super specific, but it should come pretty naturally of just, okay, I'm going to ignore a lot of this stuff that you're doing, that it's not harmful. And as soon as you're calm, like, thank you so much for calming down, or just providing them a pat on the back. And, like, do you want to join your sister and watch X, Y, or Z? It doesn't have to be like, thank you for calming down. You're now, doing what your sister's doing, or your brother, or if only you had calmed down as quick as your brother. We want to avoid that. For using pivot with rapidly repeating behavior. So in a situation where a child's like rapidly repeating whatever the junk behavior is, then that pivot piece where we talked about, not pivoting back too fast, you can make that much shorter. And you'll, really find what works best for your child. So as the child's behaviors start to slow down, you can wait for, slightly longer breaks to pivot back, but being very, very mindful not to reward the junk behavior. That's just going to be the biggest piece here. And so with that, you may have to do it more than once. You may have to pivot back and forth a few times. It may be, like if you are able to walk out of the room and the child comes and gets you calmly, and you say, like, okay, you're ready, let's go. And then they, turn it back on. It's turning away again, and just repeating that process and that procedure, so that you help teach your child, these are the positive behaviors. This is going to gain you great attention, and genuine interaction from me, and this won't, because these aren't behaviors that you should be engaging in frequently. And then obviously there are situations where you have to attend to some of the junk behavior. So, the example here, like you can't talk loudly in church or a library. So this is where, you'd want to be very specific with those rewards or the reinforcement. So making sure you're just saving up whatever that the big value is. So this is going to be one of those behaviors that may be more difficult for your child. So you'll want to make sure you have saved up one of those big rewards. You can also work on subtle cues or little things that will help your child understand, like, oh, okay, this is junk behavior. I need to, be stopping this. So giving them attention a little bit more frequently or in different ways that fits whatever setting you're in, to hopefully stop junk behavior from either happening or escalating. And then giving reminders to them. So talking about it beforehand, talking about it during, or, being able to remind them in some way with some sort of signal or something that, they're doing a great job, we're almost done, and helping, provide some of that feedback to them, again, to either minimize the junk behavior, eliminate it, or at least stop it from escalating. A big thing also that is important to mention and talk about is the behavior burst, or if you are in the behavioral field in some way, an extinction burst we talk about. But basically, sometimes behavior that we're targeting can get worse. It'll get worse for a short period of time when you're trying to manage it this way. So if it was something that your child used to get a ton of attention for, and all of a sudden they're going to try to amp it up. They're going to take it from 0 to 60 very quickly, in order to try to gain that attention. They're trying to find a different way to get it. So it could happen either less often or with less intensity if you're able to consistently use that pivot. So they're gaining access to attention when it's, appropriate, and not when it's inappropriate, but you're able to kind of go back and forth as you need to. The example here is like a vending machine. So if you were, you're used to getting the item, very classic example that's, immediate reinforcement, money, push the buttons, you get whatever it is. Money, push the buttons, and the item stuck. I don't even know if people have vending machines anymore in this way, but the item stuck and it doesn't come. And we all then, you hit it, you punch the buttons again and again and again, and you increasingly engage in different behaviors because you're trying to figure out how to get that item because you've always gotten it in the past. That's the best way to think about this in terms of the behavior burst for a child too, where it just becomes like, how do I get this attention? I used to get it, so I'm going to amp it up and try to get it in some way that I can. That also, there are some caveats with that as well, though. And it's similar to when we talked about the slide before, certain settings are, you just can't tolerate that burst, or you are not able to kind of hang with it and push through and do pivot back and forth because, of whatever the situation is at the time. So remembering that, even if your child shows some junk behavior while acting appropriately, still don't attend to that if possible. Always focus on that desirable behavior. And then the biggest thing here is it's obviously best to not give in during a behavior burst or really during any of these like junk behaviors or something. But if you do have to give in, I will shockingly tell you, I don't know if it's shocking or not, but sometimes it is to parents I work with, to give in early. So I want to dive into that a little bit too, because I think a lot of times, when we're talking about how to, handle or manage certain things with children, again, typically developing children or children with disabilities, we are talking about, okay, follow through and hold strong. And sometimes I think, parents can feel at a loss of like, I just can't today, right? Like there's so many days where we just can't, especially in these times right now. I think that's even more important to be very cognizant of. So I always say, if you're going to give in, it is important to give in early. And this is why, because when your child's engaging in problem behavior in general, challenging behavior, but especially, this burst where we're seeing a little bit more than typical, what they're doing is they're basically testing you. So they're trying to figure out, okay, where's the break point, right? Like how big do I have to go to get what I want? Because I used to get what I want, and like I'm gonna, suit up and I'm gonna get what I want here. So I would say first, always follow through, like I said. But if you have somewhere you have to go, if it's, putting their shoes on and your kids just throwing a fit and they won't do it, and you, no matter what, have to leave in 5 minutes, and from all the time that you've been trying to use these tools or trying to decrease some of this behavior, that it takes your kid about 20-25 minutes, where you're kind of doing this pivot or reinforcement, or you're just waiting them out and you're battling that, and you don't have that time, then give in early, or just right from the start, put the shoes on for them. Because what you want to avoid is teaching your child that you do have this break point, and it's after they do something big, it's after they break something, it's after they are just throwing this enormous tantrum, and you have to go, and they now have learned like, oh, I just have to wait mom out this long, I just have to throw the biggest fit, I just have to rip this off, I just have to do X, Y, or Z, and then I get my way. So that's why I say, it's good to be proactive. If it's a time where you're like, I don't have time to battle them today, either don't, or tell them, like, hey, it's time to go, get your shoes on. And your kid's like, no, I don't want to, whatever. If you don't have time, the best thing to do is to say, okay, I'll help you, or okay, we'll put them on in the car and you get going. And your kid is probably going to be like, what just happened? That was easy. But I'd rather it be easy. I'd rather them think it's easy versus it's, takes me this long to push mom or dad to their break point. So that's my piece there of why, obviously first try not to give in, but if you have to give in early, give yourself a break, set yourself up for success later, to where, you're not teaching your child, where that power struggle ends and who's going to win at the end. And it's also just, such a terrible situation to be in, and to, be in that struggle with your child. We want to avoid that as much as possible. And so really, lastly here, the best tools are free. So use reinforcement, like I said, to your advantage. Avoid those coercive responses, or like we talked about, those more typical responses when possible. Pivot away from that junk. And then remember that, your attention is absolutely your best tool that you have at your disposal to use. And, reinforcement does not have to be this, big drawn out reward or something like that. It truly can just be something simple as, praise or a pat on the back, like we talked about. So thank you guys.
We had someone who said their 3-year-old just started to go to childcare, and their teacher has been telling them that she is following a child who does have some challenging behaviors, and now she is trying to follow those behaviors. So what should this parent do to solve that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have seen that a lot in my career, and also in childcare with my daughter, because I see all of the childcare rooms there. So I would say first that, based on just that little bit of information, the child likely sees the attention that that other child is receiving as valuable. So it could be that the teacher, or the worker in that room, is, just not able to provide as much attention as possible to all the other kids if she or he is always managing that child. And so I would first guess that that attention is pretty valuable. So it could be a mixture of things. I would probably recommend, trying to talk about it, and maybe, asking, like, well, what happens when, so-and-so does X, Y, and Z, and see how the child responds. Like, oh, Mrs., so-and-so runs over, and then Mr. So-and-so comes in. And that should give you an idea of if it is, that attention piece, in terms of, just like, oh, that kid's getting really great things that I wish I was getting, not necessarily if he's getting in trouble, he or she, but just that attention. And then trying to maybe work with the daycare in terms of, is there anything else that can be done, during those situations? If it is that, the class can be, either moved to a different area of their room, or that child can be, potentially moved to a different area until, they're able to calm down, so that the other kids, the attention they're getting isn't kind of being, essentially, removed from them, just for that child.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I love that you talked about being independent being a good thing, right? And so when that child is sitting on the floor and you're trying to put their shoes on and they're like, no, I want to do it. And you're like, oh my goodness, it's going to take you 15 minutes and it would take me 30 seconds. Why don't we just let me do it? It's because they're trying to be little tiny independent human beings, and it's actually a really good thing, even though it might seem super frustrating.
Yes, absolutely. Which you heard, and I'm so sorry, I have an 8-month-old. And so we're in the prime of finger foods, I guess, and feeding. And I am definitely seeing myself just not doing well with that, because I'm like, oh, I'll just feed you so it doesn't get everywhere. And I'm, realizing, okay, I think she just is going to get messy, which is difficult sometimes.
Yeah, and you don't have to apologize about your kiddo. You are a parent, and you're working from home in the evenings, so it is what it is. I just appreciate you being here. So no need to apologize about that at all. Megan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for presenting this information. I know that this is super helpful. And so we're just super appreciative of you taking time out of your evening away from your family to be able to present for us tonight.
Oh, absolutely. It truly was my pleasure.
You all have a good one, and thank you so much for being here tonight.